All right, let's get right into it. There's this story we all kind of hear about modern India, right? That its democracy, its unity, and even its secularism were basically handed down from the British. But what if that whole story isn't just missing a few pieces, but is flat out wrong? Today, we're going to dig into a really powerful argument that flips that narrative on its head. And this is the big question, isn't it? It really gets to the heart of this entire explainer. It challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about the world's largest democracy, and it forces us to look way, way deeper into its past. The source we're looking at today argues pretty much that. For way too long, the history of India has been told through a lens that was actually created by its colonizers. And the point of that lens? Well, it was to make India look like a place that needed to be saved from itself. So let's unpack the evidence that tells a very different story. Okay, so let's kick things off with democracy. The argument we're exploring begins by taking apart a very old and frankly very stubborn colonial idea about how Asian societies have always been governed. This was the big excuse for colonialism. This whole theory of Oriental despotism, it basically said that people in the East were, just naturally tyrannical and couldn't rule themselves, that they needed a civilizing mission to show them the way. But when you actually look at the history, it tells a completely different story. And this slide just lays out the contrast perfectly. The myth was this idea of despotism, but the reality, according to our source, was the existence of these ancient Indian republics called the Gana Sanghas, which literally means the rule of the multitude. What's just wild about this is how incredibly sophisticated these ancient republics were. We are talking about massive representative assemblies, elected leaders, formal rules for debate. They even had an official job for the collector of voting sticks and had ways to do both open and secret ballots. These are things we think of as modern, but they were happening in India over 2,000 years ago. And this brings us to a really critical point. If democracy was really a gift, you'd expect the teachers to be, ahead of the students, right? But look at this. India gave universal suffrage to every single adult citizen, man, woman, rich, poor, from the moment it was founded in 1950. That was years before the U.S. fully guaranteed voting rights for all its citizens, and it was a world away from the slow, drawn-out process in the UK. This wasn't some copy-paste job, it was an assertion of a deep, indigenous democratic value. All right, let's switch gears to our second big theme. The next major colonial myth that needs tackling is this idea that the British are the ones who created a unified India. I'm sure you've heard this line before, or some version of it. The idea that India was just this chaotic mess of tiny kingdoms until the British showed up with their trains and their maps and pulled it all together. But again, the source material argues this totally ignores the powerful unifying forces that were already in motion. And a perfect example of this, the Maratha Empire. By the middle of the 18th century, they had built a huge subcontinental empire. And this wasn't just about conquest for the sake of conquest. It was fueled by a political ideology of Hindavi Swarajya, which means self-rule of the Indian people. They really saw themselves as defenders of a unified cultural and political entity. This table from the source does a great job of spelling out the difference. The Marathas were all about indigenous rule, and their legitimacy came from protecting the people. The British Raj, it was about extracting resources, and its legitimacy came from conquest. These were just two fundamentally different projects. The British didn't start the process of unification. They came in and hijacked it. And think about this. When the British finally left, they didn't exactly leave behind a tidy, unified country. They left a fractured map with over 560 princely states that were technically free to just become their own independent nations. The scale of that challenge was just immense. And this is where the story of Indian agency is just impossible to deny. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel pulled off this absolutely brilliant three-step strategy. Try diplomacy first, then apply political pressure, and only as a last resort, use decisive force. It was an incredible act of statecraft that actually forged the modern Indian Union. It wasn't something that was simply inherited from the Raj. So, we've talked about democracy and unity, but what about the world of ideas? Well, the source argues that India, far from being some kind of closed-off society, has always been defined by its intellectual sovereignty. You know this stereotype, right? This idea of an insular East just waiting for Western ideas to arrive. But there's tons of evidence of a philosophical bridge between ancient India and Greece. Ideas were flowing in both directions. India was never a passive bucket waiting to be filled with knowledge. It was an active, equal player in a global conversation. The source has a great term for this, cultural plasticity. It's this really deep-seated confidence that lets a culture take in foreign ideas, argue with them, and then absorb the best parts without feeling like it's losing its own identity in the process. And the Yavana Jataka is a perfect case study. In the 2nd century, Indian scholars translated a Greek text on astrology. But they didn't just copy and paste it. They actually praised the Greeks, the Yavanas, as wise sages, calling them rishis for their scientific knowledge. And then they integrated that knowledge so completely into their own system that it just became Indian. Now that is cultural confidence. Okay, this leads us to our final theme, the source's argument for a uniquely Indian model of secularism, one that wasn't born from some government policy, but from the very fabric of its civilization. So the argument here is that Western multiculturalism is often kind of skin deep. It's a relatively new policy that often struggles to handle deep differences, which can lead to a lot of friction. The source contrasts this with Indian pluralism, which it calls soul deep, this organic, natural ability developed over centuries to live alongside people with profoundly different philosophical beliefs. And this story just captures that spirit so perfectly. The legend goes that when Parsi refugees who were fleeing persecution arrived in India, the local king showed them a full glass of milk, basically saying, "Sorry, we're full, we have no room." In response, a Parsi priest simply stirred a spoonful of sugar into the milk to show that they would enrich the society, not displace it. And this isn't just some nice story. History actually backs it up. India is the only country where Parsis have lived for over 1,000 years without ever facing persecution. Jewish communities thrived there for 2 millennia without the kind of anti-Semitism that was tragically common in Europe. This really points to an indigenous tradition of offering refuge and accepting difference. Now, the source also dives into a really key point of tension here. It argues that while this kind of pluralism is totally natural for dharmic traditions, we're talking Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, a real conflict shows up with the political theology of Islamism. And the core issue it points to? It's all about sovereignty. See, in a democracy, the power, the sovereignty, is with the people. Their representatives can make and change the laws. But in contrast, the concept of hakimiyat says that sovereignty belongs only to God, and that his law, the Sharia, can't be changed and is above any human-made parliament. And that, the source argues, creates a real structural challenge for a secular state. So, to wrap this all up, the source's big conclusion is that India's defining modern features aren't just some borrowed gifts, they're homegrown realities. Democracy is presented as a deep-rooted heritage, unity is an indigenous destiny, openness is a timeless strength, and secularism is a lived historical practice. And that leaves us with this final, really powerful question. According to this narrative, understanding this history isn't just about getting the past right. It's about shaping the future with a renewed sense of who you are. So what happens when a nation fully reclaims its own story? That's definitely something to think about.